Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today I'm going to be talking about a card that single-handedly generated the most questions out of any of the cards in the new set for me. If you've already looked at the thumbnail, you know I'm talking about Lagrella the Magpie. And I thought it was really interesting that most of these questions were not about specific card interactions. Rather, they were more general, and a lot of them took the form, how does this card even work anyway? And so I'm definitely going to be talking about that, but I'm also going to throw in a couple of bonus interactions that I think are going to be really helpful to know if you play this card in any formats. Ready? Let's get started. So Lagrella has an ability that does two different things, and I think that a lot of the reason why it's confusing is because A, it has a lot of stuff going on, and B, it has a really different templating from a lot of other types of cards that do similar sorts of things. And so I'm going to go through step by step exactly how this ability works. So like I said before, Lagrella has one ability that is composed of two different parts. And the first part says that when Lagrella enters the battlefield, you can exile any number of other target creatures. You can kind of think about this as like a souped up Banisher Priest. So let's notice that you have to target all of the creatures, and let's also notice that it says other creatures, which means you cannot exile Lagrella itself. And let's also notice that it says that the creatures have to be controlled by different players, which means that you can exile at most one creature for each player. So if Amy and Nick are playing, you would be able to exile one of Amy's and one of Nick's creatures. If there was a third player involved in the game, then you would additionally be able to get one of that player's creatures, and so on. Notice that it says up to, which means you do not need to choose one creature for each player, but you are able to choose one creature for each player if you want to. So you can leave any number of players out and not have any creatures of theirs get exiled, or you can have a creature from any number of players that you want get exiled. So all those creatures are going to stay being exiled from the time when the ability resolves and exiles them to the time when Lagrella leaves the battlefield. And so yeah, it basically works like a really souped up Banisher Priest that can get one creature from each player. So that's alright. The second part of the ability says that when a creature returns to the battlefield under your control this way, then you can put 2+1/+1 counters on it. And so when I was going through the first part of the ability, you might have been wondering, well, why would I ever want to exile one of my own creatures? It is optional, so of course you do not have to, but Lagrella will sweeten the pot for you and make it so that if you do exile one of your own creatures, that creature will get 2+1/+1 counters when it comes back. So that's what the other part of that ability does. So a couple of things that I think makes this really confusing is the fact that, well, one, it's all stapled together. And so we'll talk a little bit about the rules justification for why it is that way. So if you notice, this isn't two separate abilities. It's one ability, all of it is one ability, and it has two different parts. And the reason it couldn't be two separate abilities is because if you had an ability that triggers when the creature comes back into play, then you're going to have a problem because Lagrella is the permanent that has that ability, but the creature doesn't come back into play until Lagrella leaves the battlefield. So at the time when that ability is supposed to trigger, Lagrella will not be on the battlefield, and so therefore the permanent with that triggered ability is not going to have itself in play in order to see that ability trigger. So that's the reason why we had to go with something a little bit more exotic for how this ability is set up. And so basically the way that it actually works is the Lagrella has a triggered ability that triggers when it enters the battlefield, and as part of the resolution of this triggered ability, it sets up another triggered ability that is going to trigger when the creature that you exiled comes back into play under your control. And so that second triggered ability is not going to be something that's an ability of Lagrella itself, it's rather just going to be something that exists out there in the game land somewhere, and the game knows anytime that creature is going to enter the battlefield again, that is something that's going to cause that game land triggered ability to trigger and put the +1/+1 counters on it. If you saw my video where I talked about how Dress Down interacted with dashing a Ragavan, this is kind of a similar concept. When you dash a Ragavan, the thing that returns the Ragavan to its owner's hand is also a triggered ability that gets set up and exists in the game somewhere. So even if the Ragavan loses all of its abilities, that doesn't matter, and it still will get returned to its owner's hand at the end of turn. And if you're wondering, Blitz actually does the exact same sort of thing, so you can use that information however you want. So, with this being the case, you can see that the triggered ability is a little bit more complicated because you have this delayed trigger action going on. So that's the reason why they had to do it that way. Now that we've got a good baseline understanding for how this card actually functions, let's take a look at a couple of interactions that I think would be important to understand if you're playing this card. First of all, let's say that Amy plays a Lagrella and says she wants to exile Nick's Grizzly Bears. Nick responds by using a lightning bolt against the Lagrella. What happens? And if we have this situation come up, we can take a look at the Lagrella and see that its triggered ability is going to exile the Grizzly Bears until Lagrella leaves the battlefield. However, if Nick responds to that ability by killing the Lagrella, then the Lagrella has already left the battlefield. What that means is that the Grizzly Bears is not going to leave the battlefield at all, and it's just going to stay where it is. It's not going to have any zone changes, and it's not going to be exiled forever. Now, bear in mind that if this ability was worded a little bit differently, for example, if the thing that returned the creature to the battlefield was its own separate triggered ability, such as the way something like Fiend Hunter is worded, well, in a case like that, then you definitely would have a different answer. But based on the way that Lagrella actually is worded, then the Grizzly Bears is just going to stay in play and it's not going to get exiled at all. Nothing is going to happen to it. So that's one kind of important interaction that I could see coming up with this card. Another really common one I think is going to come up is the observation that the thing that puts the +1/+1 counters on the creature when it comes back is actually a triggered ability. A lot of other cards, such as Otherworldly Journey, that do similar sorts of things, actually have the creature enter the battlefield with the +1/+1 counters already on them. With Lagrella, you have the creature enter the battlefield, and then a triggered ability triggers that puts the +1/+1 counters on when the triggered ability resolves. Now, that is kind of interesting because it opens up the door for some plays that aren't usually possible. So, for example, if Amy were to play a Lagrella and have it exile her own Grizzly Bears, then when the Grizzly Bears re-entered the battlefield, Nick would be able to play a Lightning Bolt in response to the triggered ability that gives it the +1/+1 counters. And he would be able to kill the Grizzly Bears before it got too big for the Lightning Bolt to handle. And again, this play isn't really going to be possible for most of the other types of effects that do this sort of thing, because when something gets exiled and gets returned to the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on it, well, the +1/+1 counters getting put on it is going to happen immediately before the creature enters the battlefield, and so therefore there is not going to be any time where the creature is on the battlefield and it doesn't have +1/+1 counters on it. However, because of the peculiar way that Lagrella's ability is worded, it actually works a little bit differently. This ability is going to return the creature to the battlefield, and then a triggered ability that goes on the stack and can be responded to is going to trigger, and when that triggered ability resolves, it's going to put +1/+1 counters on the creature. If you respond to that triggered ability, then there is a window of time for you to do that before the creature gets bigger. This is definitely a really cool card, but I could certainly see how someone would be confused at its first reading. I even had to go through the ability a couple of times before I really understood everything that was going on. Hopefully now you have a good understanding for how this ability works and what kinds of things you can do with it. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.